Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Politics and geopolitics. That's foreign policy for the prospective Trump administration, the president-elect in New York, meeting frequently with advisors and possibilities at State Department. Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, Major American Jewish Organizations, joins me. Malcolm, it is a pleasure to sit with someone who is not now on a short list to be Secretary of State.
That's true. There are three of us left in America, I think.
However, the Secretary of State job is critical to the defense of the State of Israel and to the peace of the Middle East.
And to the interests of the United States in the world.
Why right now is this a good moment for a strong Secretary of State? What needs to be done?
Because of the absence of America for so long, the feeling of American disengagement, especially in the Middle East, but also in Africa and other parts of the world. They are looking to American leadership, and I think a strong Secretary of State will enable the president to rebuild the confidence and the sense that America is engaged and cares.
We welcome our colleague, John Bolton of the American Enterprise Institute, former ambassador from the United States to the United Nations, writing most recently in the London Times. We're going to move through large issues here to ask John's guidance. First, the global NATO. This is an idea that I learned from John in the London Times, was first suggested by a former Prime Minister of Spain, Mr. Aznar. John, a very good evening to you. What is global NATO? What does it satisfy?
Well, I think what Prime Minister Aznar had in mind was making sure that the NATO alliance didn't crumble after the end of the Soviet Union. And it has had a kind of crisis of identity and loss of direction because of that uncertainty over a number of years. So Aznar's idea, kind of a League of Democracies, as was once discussed by Senator John McCain, is take NATO global, bring in countries like Japan, Australia, Singapore, Israel, countries that are of the West civilizationally, if not geographically. And I think it would add real purpose and direction. We've got a lot of threats around the world, not least of which are terrorism and proliferation, and a global NATO could go a long way toward helping us get a structure that would work worldwide, as NATO has worked so well in Europe.
And you see this, John, as part of the effort to redo the international agencies that have been allowed just really, I guess, to flounder on for many years. They existed, they served a purpose, they may continue to serve a purpose, but in the case of NATO, this would revitalize its mission?
Yeah, certainly the United Nations, the Security Council, the other political decision-making bodies of the UN have long since ceased to provide any kind of collective security. NATO's been a success, but as you were just pointing out, with under the last 8 years, as Obama has pulled back, even NATO has suffered increased problems. So by changing the mission, by broadening the scope, as Eisenhower used to say, if you can't solve a problem, look at it from a different context, and this is a way of doing it.
The contest that NATO now faces in Eastern Europe and the contest that our allies face in East Asia with the aggression in the South China Sea, would that be answered by a global NATO, a non-regional NATO?
I think it would go a long way. For example, Singapore, one of the suggestions that Aznar made, it's an excellent one. You could imagine others, South Korea as well, Australia, New Zealand, if it wants to get back into the game. I can tell you that, for example, in South Korea, whereas 15 years ago people would go out of their way to do anything to avoid North Korea, it was really a very strange response in some respects to the North Korean nuclear threat. Today, after 5 North Korean nuclear tests, South Koreans are more resolved than Americans are at this point because they see the threat. They see the risk of a nuclear North Korea. They see the growth of China. They know what's happening in the South China Sea, and they know that every barrel of oil that comes to South Korea, as well as Taiwan and Japan, goes through the South China Sea. So if Beijing gets control over those lines of communication, their economies are threatened. These threats really are interlinked around the world, and the common international interests that we share with these other potential members really make them excellent additions to NATO and give us a global focus to handle global problems.
North Korea's nuclear weapons program is linked to Iran, so we move to that. Police the Iran deal or end it?
Well, I think we should end it. Look, number one, the deal in its substantive terms is a strategic debacle for the United States. Even if Iran scrupulously complies with this badly negotiated, badly, vaguely worded agreement, they're on a path to nuclear weapons in 10 or 15 years. My view is they're not abiding by the agreement. They never had any serious intention to, and that they're actually much closer. They can pick the time they want to get to weaponization because our intelligence is simply not adequate. And I do think in this connection that the axis of evil is more than just a metaphor. I think we've had evidence for nearly 20 years that Iran and North Korea have been cooperating on ballistic missiles. There's every reason to think that's true of the nuclear warhead part of that issue as well. You know, the nuclear reactor destroyed in Syria by Israel in September of 2007 was being built by North Koreans. They didn't end up in the middle of the Syrian desert by accident. They were there for a purpose. And I think most people who know the Syrian situation know that they couldn't pay for that reactor. It was almost certainly being paid for by Iran, a kind of a three-way joint venture. That's now a heap of smoking rubble, probably not smoking anymore, but it's a heap of rubble thanks to the Israeli Air Force. And I think Iran's lesson from that is, instead of doing it in Syria, conduct your illicit nuclear activities under a mountain in North Korea. It's a clear deal. The North Koreans get money. The Iranians get a safe place to enrich uranium and do other nuclear-related matters.
And North Korea gets the technology. Let me ask you about, on the Iran issue, you had a vote in the House of 419 to 1,
yes.
A slight
vote.
margin.
Stunning.
But an important message, building on the theme of what you said.
The one that got away from you.
And this was on the Iran Sanctions Act, and the one probably didn't know what the bill was. So, given the likely resistance from Europe, Russia, how do you construct the America moving out of the JCPOA? Or would it be better to leave it for now and instead move on a whole series of measures to introduce new sanctions that would target the banking industry, for instance, and others, which is really the most sensitive area for the Iranians?
Well, I think we should do all of the above, and I think this vote in the House, as you say, is a very significant signal. We've had a situation where the Iranians have had the chutzpah, and I use that word deliberately, to say that the United States is already not complying with its obligations under the agreement because Iran isn't getting the economic benefits they thought they were. And this has produced in Secretary of State John Kerry an effort to free up more, particularly on the U.S. side, trade and investment deals with Iran. Even Paul Ryan, as mild-mannered a man as there is in modern American politics, called Secretary Kerry a shill for the Iranians, acting as though he were the president of the Tehran Chamber of Commerce. So Iran's never going to be satisfied with our performance. And, the notion that you can hold them to the terms of the deal or force them to would be an interesting idea if the terms of the deal themselves weren't so poorly written. We've just had the second example of Iran exceeding the total amount of heavy water it's permitted. Right. But the 130 tons. But the language of the deal itself says something about in connection with Iran's needs and so on. So it looks like a limit of 130 tons, but it's not. And you can't hold Iran or anybody else to jello, which is what this deal is.
So what he's saying is, even if the Europeans or the UN challenges it, without access to the American market, they can't improve their economy. So we can do this regardless of what the other parties to the JCPOA do.
Yeah, look, the Europeans fell for the craven Obama approach to negotiation because they wanted economic benefits out of this. And Iran knew that. They played the West for suckers, and now they're going to play the Europeans as long as they can. So I think you need to address the political reality. You need to demonstrate leadership. I said in several places that we should abrogate the deal in the early days of the administration. It's going to require enormous diplomacy. The Europeans are going to scream in agony that all their wonderful economic deals with Iran are now in jeopardy. And so I think American business, European business should face the reality. They can do trade and investment with Iran if they want. They just might not be able to do it with the United States.
There's a new Secretary General at the United Nations, Guterres of Portugal. Right. What's your measure of him, John, to work with the United States?
Well, he does come from a NATO ally. We have to give him that. But honestly, I don't see much change in the approach at the UN under his leadership. I just think this is another example when they pick somebody who is number one. Let's not forget a socialist who has served in the UN system. Unlike the change election we just had in the United States, this is going to be business as usual at the UN, and that's never good news.
Malcolm, is it your measure that Guterres can be educated?
But I think John is right about in terms of the background. But this was a compromise candidate. It was very cleverly maneuvered. And if you remember, there was that secret meeting, John, or a conference call or communication
with Vladimir Putin,
yes, eliminating the United States from the process, where the French, the Chinese, and the Russians agreed on the division of responsibilities. And I think the all the talk of a woman from East Europe, which was supposedly the markers for the next Secretary General, went out the window. And he was sort of the safe candidate. Is that your impression as well?
Yeah, and we'll see when he picks his top advisors, the undersecretaries general, whether this deal that you mentioned in fact comes true. I think the United States was dealt out of this. It was Eastern Europe's turn. The Russians just couldn't get the person they wanted, so they were determined to have no Eastern European.
John Bolton of the American Enterprise Institute, former ambassador to the United Nations from the United States, Malcolm Hoenlein, and it's the London Times piece you want to read. It's quite comprehensive, Mr. Bolton's thoughts about the global UN and other world bodies. Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, Major American Jewish Organizations. I'm John Batchelor.